When people hear the words International Monetary Fund or IMF, certain ideas immediately come to mind: bailout packages, emergency loans, financial rescue, stability. But when I think about the IMF, there is one number that overshadows everything else, one figure so large that it reframes the entire conversation, and that number is $1.4 trillion. Because in 2023 alone, developing nations spent roughly $1.4 trillion simply servicing their foreign debt. And this figure does not include paying back the actual loan amounts. This is only the interest, the cost of borrowing itself. More than $1 trillion transferred not into schools, hospitals, roads, or public infrastructure, but into the accounts of creditors headquartered in financial centers like Washington, London, and Paris. And while debt repayment in principle is not unreasonable, the deeper issue is the system behind it, because for every single dollar of aid sent to the global south, an estimated $14 leave those economies through undervalued exports, overpriced imports, and profits extracted by foreign investors. And over the past 60 years, this imbalance has drained approximately $62 trillion out of developing nations and into banks, corporations, and financial institutions based in wealthy countries. And at the center of this vast financial machinery stands the International Monetary Fund, an institution often presented as a neutral stabilizer, but one that increasingly resembles a global debt enforcer, because while the IMF is marketed as a last resort lifeline for countries in crisis, in practice, it often locks them into cycles of austerity, forcing governments to trade sovereignty for survival. And according to United Nations data, the developing world now carries a debt burden of roughly $31 trillion, which on its own might not seem catastrophic when compared to the United States' debt of around $38 trillion. But the comparison breaks down quickly because, unlike the US, these countries are given no flexibility, no relief, and no real reset, regardless of how many reforms they implement or how much aid they receive. The debt becomes harder to manage, and daily life becomes more difficult for ordinary citizens. And today, nearly 60% of low-income countries are officially classified as being in debt distress, meaning they are struggling just to meet interest payments. And the scale of this problem is staggering, because many governments now spend more money paying interest to creditors than they do investing in development, education, healthcare, or infrastructure. And this pattern repeats itself over and over again. A country runs out of foreign currency. The IMF steps in with promises of stability and emergency loans, but every bailout comes with a detailed instruction manual on how to run the economy. And when the actual outcomes are examined, the results are deeply troubling, because independent valuations show that countries under IMF programs consistently grow far less than expected, with average first-year growth coming in about 1.5 percentage points below IMF projections, a miss so large that it reflects entire economies slowing down instead of recovering. And when you look inside the IMF itself, the imbalance becomes even clearer, because out of nearly 190 member countries, the United States alone holds veto power over all major decisions. And overall, the global north controls roughly 9 times more voting power than the global south combined, meaning that while the IMF is technically a global institution, in practice, it functions like a boardroom dominated by the richest nations on earth, a structure that looks uncomfortably similar to a modern form of colonialism, because colonization never truly disappeared. It simply evolved, and instead of armies and direct rule control, is now exercised through debt interest rates and economic policies written thousands of miles away. And to understand how this system emerged, we have to look back to the period following the collapse of formal colonial rule, when nations across Asia and Africa gained independence between 1945 and 1960, stepping into sovereignty after decades of exploitation, only to find themselves trapped in a new struggle because independence on paper did not undo centuries of extraction. The borders they inherited were arbitrary lines drawn in foreign offices, splitting communities and forcing rivals together, and their economies were hollowed out, lacking industry, infrastructure, and access to capital. And while defenders of colonialism often argue that colonial powers invested in infrastructure, what they omit is that most roads and railways led directly to ports, designed not to develop local economies, but to extract resources efficiently. And when independence finally arrived, colonizers left behind division, debt, and fragile states. And faced with empty treasuries and urgent needs, newly independent nations did what almost any government would do. They borrowed, and this is where the IMF enters the story, because its origins date back to 1944, when delegates from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a post-war financial system that could prevent another global collapse. And from that conference emerged 2 powerful institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, with one of the key architects being Harry Dexter White, an economist who rose from a poor immigrant Jewish family, entered college at age 30, and eventually became one of the most influential figures in the U.S. Treasury. And at Bretton Woods, White helped design a system intended to stabilize currencies, manage balance of payments, crises, and promote global economic stability. And initially, the IMF's mission was genuinely limited, offering short-term loans to countries facing temporary financial shocks, particularly currency collapses or trade imbalances, with the understanding that these loans were meant to buy time, not create long-term dependence. But, as history often shows, temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent. And by the 1970s, the global economy had shifted dramatically. The Bretton Woods system collapsed, oil prices surged, and developing nations borrowed heavily just to stay afloat. And by the 1980s, what began as liquidity problems evolved into a full-scale debt crisis. As policy errors at home collided with interest rate hikes and economic shifts in industrialized nations, triggering a domino effect across Latin America, Africa, and Eastern Europe, and the IMF returned with rescue packages. But this time, the rules had changed, because these new loans came with strict conditions known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, reforms that promised stability, but delivered submission, locking countries into cycles of dependence where each bailout required deeper concessions, and governments began shaping national budgets around IMF demands instead of domestic priorities, marking the emergence of what critics call the IMF debt trap, where once a country enters IMF oversight, it rarely escapes. Because SAPs required governments to devalue their currencies, slash public spending, privatize state-owned enterprises, dismantle protections for local industries, and redesign tax systems to guarantee repayment. And while economic growth sometimes appeared on paper, the reality on the ground was grim: factories closed, jobs disappeared, imported goods flooded markets. And profits flowed outward, benefiting a small elite tied to export markets and multinational corporations that acquired privatized assets at bargain prices. And as criticism mounted, the IMF did not abandon its approach. It rebranded it under a more technical name, conditionality, a term that framed control as guidance, and under this system, each loan installment depended on meeting specific targets, with failure threatening immediate economic collapse, effectively giving the IMF leverage over national policy. And the consequences were severe: unemployment rose, public revenues fell, basic services became unaffordable, and social programs were dismantled in the name of fiscal discipline, with the poorest populations paying the highest price. And the damage is visible in real-world examples such as Zambia, where between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments consumed nearly 38% of the national budget, while healthcare and education funding declined sharply, illustrating how debt servicing crowds out investment in people. And over time, the IMF expanded its influence far beyond balance of payments issues, reshaping laws, privatizing industries, liberalizing trade, and restructuring banking systems, particularly across Africa, where decades of reforms failed to deliver promised prosperity, leaving the continent with lower shares of global exports, collapsed manufacturing sectors, and persistent capital flight, estimated at nearly $88.6 billion per year, draining wealth before it can be reinvested locally. And this constant outflow deepens dependence on external loans, reinforcing the very cycle the IMF claims to solve. And the same model was later applied beyond the Global South, most notably in post-Soviet Russia, where so-called shock therapy liberalized prices, privatized industries, and slashed spending overnight, resulting in one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history, wiping out savings, destroying industries, and giving rise to oligarchs who acquired strategic assets for pennies. And similar patterns unfolded in Zambia, as copper sector, in Argentina, as privatization drive in the 1990s, both carried out under IMF-backed programs that promised efficiency and stability, but ended in unemployment revenue loss and social collapse, reinforcing a pattern that repeats across continents and decades. This history challenges the popular image of the IMF as a neutral global safety net, because the evidence suggests it functions as part of a broader system designed to protect the interests of the most powerful nations and their financial institutions, raising a fundamental question about whether IMF-led reform is truly about saving economies or about preserving an unequal global order that benefits those already in control.